Hello and welcome to the fourth video of Google G Suite and UiPath series. In the previous videos, we have already covered activities related to Gmail and Google Drive. And in this video, we'll explore Google Sheet activities that provide methods to automate Google Sheet interactions, including creating and editing of spreadsheets. Google Sheets are nothing but Microsoft Excel equivalent provided by Google. And any interaction with spreadsheets would basically include these four steps, namely create, read, update, and deletion of data. So in this video, we'll have a look into each of these actions and see how UiPath activities can be used in order to automate these actions. So let's just open our workflow and have a look at these activities one by one. So now that we're there in the UiPath Studio, let's create a new sequence and let's call it GSuite Activities. And if you remember from the previous videos, in order to automate any of the G Suite activities, we need to also install the package. And since we have already done that, I would not do it again. And as a next step, we would be dragging and dropping the GSuite Application Scope. So once the GSuite Application Scope is here, so let's just configure our GSuite Application Scope by adding the credentials from the previous videos. And in order to do that, we need to go back to the Google Cloud Platform. So let's just do that. And go to console. And once we are here, just go under API and services, and then under credentials, you would be able to see the credential that you have created. So if you see here, we already have the UiPath G Suite credential that was created on the OAuth. And let's just copy this by clicking on edit. And now let's just copy the client ID first and paste it here as a string. Similarly, now we'll copy the client secret. So if you're not seeing how we created this credential, just click on the link above and it would direct you to our first video of this series. And in this video, we have shown how to create the credential and set up your configuration in the Google Cloud Platform. So once we have configured the G Suite Application Scope, the next step would be to go and have a look into the sheet activities. As we said that we want to first create a Google Sheet. So for that, let's just use the create new spreadsheet activity. And if you see here in the input, the only input that you need to give in is the name of the spreadsheet that you want to create. So there is already a default value called test spreadsheet. And I would replace this with, let's say, new spreadsheet. And if you see here as an output, you get the ID of the spreadsheet. And this ID could be considered like file path in case of local drives. And since it's a Google Drive, so you get an ID for this spreadsheet. So I would just save this ID into a string variable. And let's call this variable as spreadsheet ID. So now that we have created a spreadsheet, the next step is we need to write data to the spreadsheet. And in order to do that, we'll use the activity that's called write range. And in the write range, if you go under the input panel, you see there is an input that it needs a data table that needs to be written in the sheet. And along with that, it is also asking you for a spreadsheet ID. So the spreadsheet ID is something that we had created in the previous activity. I will use that here. And under the data table, we have still now not created a data table. So let's just do that. If you remember, in one of our invoice extraction videos, we had created a CSV file. And we would be reading this CSV file into a data table. So in order to read a CSV file, there's an activity called read CSV. So let's just drag and drop this activity. And you don't need to put this inside the G Suite Application Scope because it is not a G Suite activity. And now we would just try and read this file. I'll click on this folder here. And on the documents, I've already saved the CSV file. And let's just open this. And if you see here as an output, we get a data table. So I would be saving this data table as a new DT. So I'll just call it new DT. And this new DT would then be the input for our right range activity. So let's just give it in here. So let's just do a quick recap. So we are first reading the CSV file and saving it into a data table. And then inside the GSuite Application Scope, we have first created a spreadsheet, and then we are writing the data table into this particular spreadsheet. So let's just run this workflow, and this spreadsheet should be created in the root directory of your Google Drive. So let's just run this file here. And as a first step, again, we have this consent screen wherein you have to give access to this particular application. So I would be using this particular mail ID and giving it access. And let's just click on allow. So it says that the verification has been done. And if I go back to my drive into the root directory, you would see that a new file called new spreadsheet has been created. And it has been just created right now at 4:21 p.m. So with this, we just saw how to create a new spreadsheet in Google Drive. And as a next step, now we'll try to read this particular file into a data table. So let's just go back to our UiPath Studio. If you remember, the file has been created into a root directory, but I want to move this file to another directory. And this directory is nothing but it's called GSuite, which is here. So for that, I would be using a Google Drive activity, which we had already seen in the previous video. So let's just go back to our UiPath Studio and bring this Drive activity, which is called move file. So if you see on the drive, we have a move file activity. I'll just drag and drop it here. And if you see here, it is asking for two inputs. First is the file ID. So the file ID would be same as the spreadsheet ID. And the next thing that we need is the parent ID of the folder where you want to move this file to. So let's just go back and get the ID of this particular folder, which is nothing but this random text that you see. And I would paste it here as a string. So with this, what would happen is a new sheet would be created and then it would be moved to this particular folder. So let's run this again and just wait for the new spreadsheet to be moved here in this particular folder. So that's done. So if you see here at 4:24, a new spreadsheet was created and it has been moved to my particular folder that's called GSuite. So now, as a next step, I would try and read this spreadsheet. And for that, we again have an activity under Google Sheets. So let's just again search for Sheets and look for all the activities. And if you see here under Read, we have basically 4 activities, namely Read Cell, Read Column, Read Range, and Read Row. In case of Read Cell, we get an object as an output. And in case of Read Column and Read Row, we get an array of object as an output. But we would be using the read range activity, which would give a data table as an output. So let's just drag and drop it here. So let's just assume that we want to read a file which is already in the Google Drive and we don't know the spreadsheet ID. And before I start automating it, I would first disable these activities. So just click on disable activity. And I would also move these activities inside this particular block. So at this moment, I want to read range from a spreadsheet and I don't know the ID of the spreadsheet. And that is why I would use a drive activity that is called find files and folders, which is this one here. And I've already covered how to use this particular activity in the previous video. And that's why I would just give in the search expression. And in our case, we know the name of the file, which is nothing but new spreadsheet. Let's just be sure if this is the name. So S is small, so I'll do that as well. So now under the find files and folder, we have given a search expression for the kind of file that we are looking for. And in the output, you could see that there is an option to get the ID of that particular file. So I would again use the variable called spreadsheet ID and save the ID that is being returned by this activity into this particular string variable. And this string variable will then act as an input to my read range activity. So here, if you see, there's an option to also give the range that you want to read. Since I want to read the entire sheet, I will just remove this range. And let's be sure if the name of the sheet is sheet 1. So for that, let's just go back to our Google Drive. And let's just open a new spreadsheet. So if you see here, the name of the sheet is sheet 1. Now, since I also want to be sure that the data that is being read out is correct, I would be printing this output using a message box. And for that, I need to first convert my data table into text using the output data table activity. And then we'll use a message box. So in the output table, we need to give the input as my data table that is being returned by this read range. And I would be saving the read range result into a new data table that's called new DT. And now also in the output data table, my input would go here. And I want to save it into a text, and let's call this text output as temp. And let's print this temp variable using the message box. So once we have done that, I would also make this particular activity into a comment, since we don't need to read the data table anymore. So let's just have a quick look of what we did. As a first step, we'll be using this activity to find a particular file and then return an output, which is the file ID. And the file ID would then be used inside this read range activity. And this would return a data table. And this data table would then be converted into a text and then be printed using the message box. So let's just see if we are getting the right information. And for that, I will just click on debug file. And we should soon get a message box. But before that, we need to give access to the application. And just click on allow. So once that's done, we would get a message box. And let's just again have a look into a spreadsheet. And if you see, the data matches, so it means you're now able to also read the Google Sheet. So I'll just close this and go back to my UiPath Studio. And now as a next step, I want to update this sheet with some new information. And in order to do that, I would first again disable all these activities. So let's just open our comment box and move each of these one by one into the comment box. Having done that, we have commented out every activity. And now I want to update the spreadsheet with new information. And in order to do that, I need to first read this new information from some new file. And I would again use the read CSV activity. So for that, I need to first enable it. And instead of using the new.csv, I would be using a new file that's called update.csv. And we'll be saving this file into a new data table and call it update.tt. So now we'll be using the update.dt data table, and we'll add this into our Google Sheet. So for that, let's have a look at all the activities that we have under Google Sheets. And if I go under Sheets, there are basically two activities that could be used here. One is the append row, and the other one is the write range. Since we have already seen how to use write range, at this point I would be using append row activity. So let's just drag and drop it in the center. And if you see here under the input, we need to also give the spreadsheet ID. And since we have already seen how to get the spreadsheet ID, I would again use the previously used activity. That is called the find files in folder. So let's just copy it and paste it here. And I will again minimize this comment box. So we'll be using this spreadsheet ID as an input for our append row. And now the next step is we need to also give the name of the sheet and the name of the row where we want to start appending the data to. So let's just go back to our Google Drive. And if you see here, we need to start appending data from A4. So let's just give this now as an input. And here we need to also give a row variable that needs to be appended. But since we do not have a row variable till now, we only have a data table. So we'll be using this data table and then iterating it through each row and get this row variable. So there's an activity called for each row in our data table. So we'll be using this activity. And we need to iterate through the update DT that we created before. And I would move this append row activity inside this iteration block. So I need to give the row as a variable, and in this case we already have row here. If you see here, we're still having a validation error even after passing the row variable. And if you have a look at the error, it says that it is unable to convert a system data or data row to a system array. So it means the append row activity here is accepting an array as an input, and we are providing it with a data row object. So let's just convert this row object into an array. And for that, we'll be using the function called item array. And with this object would be converted into an array. And now we are set. Let's just try and run this file. And let's go back also to our Google Sheet here. And if you see, one by one, new rows have been added to a particular sheet here. So with this, we saw how to use append row in order to update data in your Google Sheet. And now as a next step, we would be moving to delete function, which is very easy. And there are directly two activities available in order to delete data from your spreadsheet. So let's just search for sheet, and if you see here, there are basically two activities, namely the delete range and delete sheet. So with the delete range, you would have to give a particular range that you want to delete. So let's just try and use this activity first. And I will again move this activity into the comment box since we don't need it anymore. And let's just minimize it again. We would still be needing this find files in folder because we do not have the ID of this particular spreadsheet. And now let's just drag and drop the delete range. And the ID would be again the spreadsheet ID. The name of the sheet is sheet 1. So let's just give a range and call it from A1 to F1. So with this, it would be deleting the first row. And if you go and have a look at the property panel here, there is an options panel, and we have a parameter called shift. And under this, you have basically three options. No shift, either you want to shift it up or you want to shift it left. Since we'll be deleting a row and there would be a vacancy created if the row has been deleted, so we'll be shifting our data table upwards. So let's just select this option as up. And now let's just run this file. And if I go back to my spreadsheet, you would see that first row has been deleted. But just to demonstrate it again, I will go back, and instead of shifting the rows, I would select no shift. And let's again run it. And let's go back to our spreadsheet here. And if you see, our first row has been deleted and the data has not been shifted. So this is how you can use the delete range activity. And now the other option is you could also delete the entire sheet. All you need to do is, instead of giving the range as an input, you can give the entire sheet as an input. And let's try and use this as well. And if you see, we are not giving range as an input. Let's just delete this activity first. And with this, we would be deleting the sheet that we have created. So if I go back to my spreadsheet here, right now we have the sheet 1. And if I refresh it, It's still not getting deleted. So let's just go back to our activity. And if you see here, we have an error. And the error says you can't remove all the sheets in a document. And since in our document we have only one sheet, so that's why it is not deleting this particular sheet. So let's, just for demonstration, let's just add one more sheet. And again, retry this activity. And let's just run this file again. Now this should be able to delete the sheet 1. So if you see, sheet 1 has been deleted. And initially it didn't work because we had only one sheet, and Google Sheet does not allow you to delete a sheet if there's only one sheet in your entire document. And before we end this, let's just do a small recap. So we started with creating a new spreadsheet using the activity called create new spreadsheet and the write range activity. And after this, we use the activity called read range in order to read entire range in a particular spreadsheet. Thereafter, we tried to update the spreadsheet using the Append Row Activity. And in the end, we have used both the delete activities. At first, we deleted a range, and thereafter, we deleted an entire sheet. Well, that's all you need to know about the Google Sheet activities. And I've already committed the workflow into the Git repository. So just go ahead and have a look at all these activities. And if you have any questions, just feel free to comment in the comment section. In the next video, we'll have a look into Google Calendar. So stay tuned and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until then, keep automating.